So before we left, we were talking about the law of conservation of mass, how mass is not lost after a chemical reaction has occurred. So when we talk about matter, matter can be broken down to its simplest elements. And so once you get to the point of an element, it cannot be broken down any further by chemical means, and that's sort of the definition of an element. And there are over 100 naturally occurring elements on the periodic table. And several of them have been also synthesized in the lab. And so I'll point that out when we talk about the periodic table a little bit later in the lecture. So there are two different types of substances, and then there are also mixtures. And so what is a pure substance? So a pure substance can, you can either have elements, and so we know elements cannot be broken down into simpler substances by chemical means. So examples are gold, phosphorus, oxygen, iron. Any kind of element that was listed on the periodic table is considered an element. So compounds are not listed on the periodic table because they consist of two or more different elements, and they can be broken down by chemical means. And so an example would be water. It's the most simplest example we can talk about. Water can be broken down into hydrogen and oxygen gas through the use of electrolysis of water, which we've actually done in the lab, and it's kind of a neat experiment to do because you see this bubbling occurring. And so hydrogen and oxygen are gases at room temperature, and so that's what you're going to form whenever you do the reaction with hydrolysis of water at room temperature. So the properties of compounds are different from uncombined elements making up the compound. So for example, iron is different from iron oxide. Okay, it looks different, has different properties. Water is different from hydrogen gas and oxygen gas separately. Okay, so compounds are unique. There are millions of types of compounds out there. There are only a limited number of elements, but the number of compounds are continually growing as scientists are finding different ways of synthesizing new compounds in the lab. And of course, there are a lot of naturally occurring compounds out there in nature that have yet to be discovered as well. So, you know, this is a very large area, and what we're going to be talking about mostly this semester. So looking at these chemical formulas here, and I'll probably point this out later, but you know, we talked about the symbolic domain. In chemistry, we use a lot of different symbols, and so when we're talking about a compound, you have you know, letters, capital letters, sometimes a lowercase letter, and so if the element is represented by a capital, just a single capital letter, like hydrogen, for example, is a capital H, oxygen is a capital O. The 2 here represents the number of atoms that are represented by hydrogen. So in math, we normally, if we are talking about 1x, we put the 1 in front of the x, right? So in chemistry, we're opposite. We put the number behind the letter it's representing. So in algebra, you talk about 2x. Here, we're talking about H2, so 2 hydrogen atoms. If there's no subscript behind the letter, like here oxygen doesn't have a subscript, that is because oxygen, there's just 1 atom of oxygen. Okay, so in this compound you have 2 atoms of hydrogen, 1 atom of oxygen to form H2O, which we know as water. And so the same for these others. C6H12O6, that's glucose, 6 carbon atoms, there are 12 hydrogen atoms, there are 6 oxygen atoms, and that composes the molecule glucose. Silver 1 chloride. There's 1 atom of silver, 1 atom of chlorine to make silver 1 chloride. So, you know, you're going to be having to look at these symbols for different compounds, and also, you know, if you're going to talk about a single element, it's just going to have the symbol there, and sometimes there's a subscript, sometimes there's not, and we'll talk about that later. But anyways, I wanted to point that out for you guys. You're first looking at this and looking at different compounds and the chemical formulas for those, so you know what it means, what the subscripts mean. Remember, it's always behind the letter. It represents how many there are. So here's 3 different pictures, and the point they're making here, with compounds, they can be broken down to simpler means. So here we have mercury 2 oxide, here as a compound, and it's being heated in this test tube, and then it's basically being broken down into mercury and oxygen. And so you can see that here. You can see the mercury and oxygen that is sort of is decomposing, and you have this silver here. I'm sorry, the mercury here looks like it has a silver color to it. Okay, so a mixture, so we talked about pure substances. You have elements and you have compounds, and then you have mixtures. So what is a mixture? A mixture is composed of 2 or more types of matter that can be present in varying amounts. It can be separated by physical changes. Evaporation is an example of a physical change. So when I think about a mixture, sometimes I think about, back whenever if you're out in the mountains and you're making a batch of, for example, my uncle used to make wine out of muscadines, and so he would take the muscadines, add sugar to it, and let it ferment. And so you can do this, and then you can actually purify the alcohol if you wanted to. The alcohol is mixed with water and sugar and different components of grape juice and that sort of thing. But you can actually separate it by what the old timers did back in the mountains. They used a still, right? They would take a mixture of their mash and they had fermented, and they were wanting to get pure alcohol out of it. So how do you do that? So the way you can separate that mixture is basically by evaporation of the alcohol. Alcohol will evaporate at a lower temperature than the water will. And so we know water will evaporate at 100 degrees Celsius, but the alcohol evaporates sooner. And so it's basically you're able to separate your alcohol from your mixture in that sense, and then you can condense it down by cooling it off, and basically you can derive your pure alcohol from that. And so anyways, for mixtures, there's 2 different types of mixtures. There's homogeneous mixtures and heterogeneous mixtures. And so it's pretty simple to be able to determine whether a mixture is homogeneous or heterogeneous, and that is by just visually looking at it. So a homogeneous mixture is going to exhibit a uniform composition and appear to be the same throughout. Most of the things that we drink are homogeneous. Like, think about a can of Coke or something. If you're drinking Coke or Diet Coke, it's the drink is homogeneous, right? It's not lumpy. I mean, if you think about the texture issues you have, when you're drinking something that is not homogeneous but is actually heterogeneous, it's pretty disgusting. If you ever had, for example, if you had pure milk right from the dairy farm and it settles out right away, and you end up having to mix or shake the jug of milk before you pour it, so it's as mixed as it can be, but it's really not a homogeneous mixture. It will settle if you just let it sit there for a little while. But for example, like Gatorade or most of the things that we drink are homogeneous. A heterogeneous mixture, it's not going to be. Your book gives you an example of Italian salad dressing. Or if you're from, like me, and you're from Louisiana, you eat gumbo all the time, but you don't just, take your gumbo and put it in a bowl. You have to mix it really well before you do that. And that's because the oil is going to separate from the water. You have this big oil slick at the top of the pot, and so you have to mix it very well before you serve it. And so that would be an example of gumbo, for example, would be an example of a heterogeneous mixture. So your book shows you here's the Italian salad dressing and how the oil is going to separate from the water phase here. You have different phases of the salad dressing, different layers. Versus here the oil droplets. Versus Gatorade, which is homogeneous mixture, and is going to, every drop is going to taste the same. You're not going to get a drop that's full of oil like you would with the salad dressing. So when we talk about atoms and molecules, so an atom, of course, is the smallest particle of an element that has the properties of that element. It can be entered into a chemical combination. This idea of the atom was first proposed by Democritus, and he was a Greek philosopher, and it was there was no experimentation back in those days. Just the idea that if you took matter and if you broke it apart and kept cutting it into pieces, eventually you get to a point where you couldn't cut anymore, and he coined that the word atom to mean indivisible. And so then you have other scientists that actually came along and developed data to support the hypothesis with quantitative measurements. John Dalton, for example, was the father of chemistry, because he was the first scientist that really came up with experimentation to prove that the atom was the smallest particle of matter. And so you have to know the difference between an atom and a molecule. So an atom is a single element, right? It's the smallest piece of an element. And a molecule consists of two or more atoms. Now, it's not specific. They could be the same type of atoms with the same element, or they can be different types of elements. So a molecule is just saying there's two or more atoms there, what we're talking about. And those atoms are together because they have a chemical bond between them. And we'll talk about the two different types of chemical bonds that occur between atoms. Actually, there are more than two, but the two main ones we will talk about this semester. The next semester we'll talk about the bonding that occurs between atoms that's not as strong as what we talk about this semester. Alright, so anyways, here's a picture of a golden nugget. So here you can see sort of what it looks like, but if you were to look at it through an electron microscope, you would see that you can see the gold atoms, how they're arranged, and they're very ordered. Solids are usually, arranged in a very order-like structure. So every little sphere represents a single gold atom. Okay. So if we look at cotton, here's a piece of cotton here, and then here's cotton fiber. Here's what the fiber looks like under the microscope. If we could keep zooming in more and more, we would see strands of cotton fiber, and here are the molecular models associated with that, each color representing a different type of element. So gray is generally considered carbon, white is hydrogen, and red is oxygen atoms. And so you can see the molecular model and what it looks like there. So for molecules, only a few elements exist as individual atoms. So the noble gases, for example, will exist as individual atoms. Most elements will be exist as a compound, will be stuck together in a molecule, okay, or in a compound. So most elements exist as molecules in which two or more atoms of the same element are bonded together. And that is certainly true. We will talk about diatomic molecules in just a second. But molecule is a very general word. Okay, most of what we're talking about this semester will be molecules. Okay, this just means what? Two or more atoms stuck together. Okay, it could be any type of atoms. It could be any type of elements stuck together. So many molecules exist of two or more atoms of different elements. And we're talking about when you have two or more atoms of different elements stuck together, that's referred to as a compound. Atoms and all types of molecules move as a unit. So here we have this picture of different types of elements. Here each sphere represents an element. Here's hydrogen gas, H2, and so we have two white spheres indicating hydrogen gas. Hydrogen is referred to as a diatomic molecule. Okay, and there's only 7 diatomic molecules on the periodic table. Okay, I'll point those out when we look at the periodic table. We have oxygen, O2 molecules, phosphorus, P4. So we have 4